Balkans? Since the time of the First World War, this region has been called the powder keg of Europe and is remembered for fratricides during the Second World War. Here, for centuries, Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim religions have coexisted. And the complex and tangled history of the local peoples cannot break their easy disposition and love for Mirak, their ability to derive joy and pleasure from simple things. Here, in the Balkans, in the year 1918 appeared, and in 2003 disappeared, the amazing state of Yugoslavia. Today, we will tell what it represented and how it is remembered by the world, apart from the inhuman and bloody events of its collapse. Rich in cultural diversity and state regimes, sometimes a peaceful and most flourishing country of Eastern Europe, illustrates the quote of Aldous Huxley history as well as possible. Like a meat pie, it's better not to look at how it's made. Speaking of Yugoslavia, we represent on the map the territory of modern Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Macedonia. In ancient times, these lands were inhabited by Illyrians, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, Slavic tribes began to establish their principalities. In the century, the Turks came to the Balkans, and for 5 centuries, part of the future, Yugoslav lands fell under Ottoman rule, absorbing into their culture Islam and Turkish customs. Especially the Albanians and Bosniaks were subjected to them. At the same time, the northern part, modern Croatia and Slovenia, were part of Austria-Hungary, which at the end of the century took over Bosnia and Herzegovina and even part of Serbia's territory, what can now be clearly seen in the architecture that has remained from that era. Having suffered from centuries of occupation by the Turks on one side and the Austro-Hungarians on the other, the Balkan peoples united and began a long and stubborn struggle for freedom and independence. But the national Yugoslav movements did not have time to gain strength, and the signs of Ottoman influence to weaken. On the 28th of June, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip, from here, the phrase Princip's business, went, assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, thereby igniting the powder keg. World War I begins. For the Balkans, it ends with the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the emergence of the first independent state from the Turks and Austro-Hungarians, Yugoslavia. The kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens, however, their parliamentary system proved ineffective in achieving national unity. Thus, the important principle of equality of all peoples living in it was not taken into account. The manifesto of the Prince Regent of Serbia, Aleksandar Karađorđević, and the Vidovdan Constitution. They ignored the rights of national minorities such as Albanians, Hungarians, Macedonians, Turks, Bosnian Muslims, and other peoples who were part of the united Yugoslav state. National political parties, except for socialists and communists, which had limited support or were soon banned, did not exist. Instead, regional interests prevailed. The concept of a Yugoslav nation did not take root. Communities and regional governments maintained their uniqueness. The parliamentary system could not effectively solve the country's problems and degenerated into constant political disputes related to the distribution of power and personal conflicts among its many leaders. Therefore, in 1929, King Alexander decided to dissolve the parliament, abolish the constitution, and introduce a royal dictatorship known as the January 6th Dictatorship, which continued to exist until 1931, along the way renaming the country. Yes, the state of Yugoslavia existed twice as a monarchy and as a socialist republic. However, this turnaround, which strengthened the dictatorship of the great Serbian bourgeoisie and the ruling dynasty, did not eliminate the causes of international contradictions. They reached an unprecedented scale during World War II, when Hitler's Germany artificially divided Yugoslavia into parts. Croatia, which suffered the least in World War I, and considering the preserved ties from the time of Austria-Hungary, was most eager to trade with European countries, and in response from Belgrade received demands to pay taxes to the state budget of Yugoslavia, and the dissatisfaction of the Serbs. Although trade with the rapidly industrializing countries of Western Europe still did not work out for predominantly agricultural Croatia, they never stopped blaming the Serbs. The most dissatisfied part of the Croats, calling themselves Ustasha Povstance, without thinking, sided with the occupiers' Nazis and proclaimed on the territory of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina about the Hitler's independent state of Croatia. It was the Ustasha regime that was responsible for the wave of mass murders, persecutions, and violence against ethnic Serbs that swept across the Balkans during World War II. According to various estimates, the number of victims amounted to several 100,000 people. These actions changed the ethnic map of modern Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia, and had a profoundly negative impact on the already strained relations between Serbs and Croats. At the same time, the Adriatic coast was handed over to fascist Italy, which also occupied Montenegro and southern Slovenia, known as the Ljubljana province. The northern part of Slovenia went to the Third Reich. Serbia came under direct German control. Hungary, under the leadership of Miklos Horthy, received Banat, Baranja, and other lands, Tsarist Bulgaria, Vardar Macedonia. Thus, the Yugoslav peoples, who had been fighting for freedom and independence for centuries, once again fell under foreign yoke. The split within the country led to the creation of various anti-fascist movements, including partisans under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito. They fought against both the occupiers and the collaborationist regimes, the same Ustasha in Croatia. Gathering a people's army of 30,000 men around him and making a huge contribution to the victory over the fascists, the liberation of Belgrade alone was worth it. Tito received support from both the Soviet Union, in the face of Stalin, and from the Allies, in the face of Churchill. In October of 1944, both leaders met in Moscow to agree on a project about spheres of influence in Europe, according to which Yugoslavia was divided 50-50 between the West and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And in the following year, Tito becomes the prime minister of the newly formed coalition cabinet of ministers, which, however, did not last long. Being in the majority, the communists voted for the liquidation of the monarchy and the formation of the Federal People's Republic. Yugoslavia, it was a socialist federation in which various regions and peoples were united in one country under the leadership of Tito. Such a reform led to a gradual reduction of tension between different ethnic groups and even the emergence of a new supranational ethnic community of Yugoslav people. 20 years after the collapse of Yugoslavia and the population census of the first year, about 1 million people still identified themselves as Yugoslavs. Tito developed the concept of self-management, preserving the independence and neutrality of the country during the Cold War, and established relations with Western countries, which annoyed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. These ideas did not fit into the rigid Stalinist doctrine, fueling a conflict that escalated in the year 1948 when Stalin began to reprimand Tito and the Yugoslav leadership for breaking discipline and failing to follow his instructions, accusing them of nationalism, non-socialist activity, and contacts with the West. The last straw that made the Soviet-Yugoslav conflict inevitable were the events of mid-March 1948 in Belgrade. At this time, Yugoslavia refused to provide Soviet specialists with information about the state of the economy. This was a routine procedure that was performed several times a year and required no agreements. However, this time a refusal was received, which the Yugoslav side motivated by the fact that the figures are undesirable for dissemination. This led to Yugoslavia being excluded from the Information Bureau of the organization uniting the communist countries, and the agreement on friendship and mutual assistance between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Yugoslavia was broken. The Soviet-Yugoslav conflict moved into the area of repression. A significant role was played by the so-called Kostov and Reich cases, who were accused of spying for Yugoslavia. As a result, the Soviet Union called Tito's party spies and killers, after which a wave of repression began, with the greatest extent in the neighboring countries of Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. In left-wing circles, there is an idealized representation of Yugoslavia as a successful example of building communism with a human face, and as a socialist state with a high level of consumption and civil liberties. This is only partly true. Of course, the scale of political repression under Tito was incomparably less than in some other countries. We all know which ones. However, the sadly famous prison on Goli Otok Island was worth it alone. According to various estimates, about 15,000 people suspected of sympathizing with Stalinism and collaborating with the Kominform, which replaced the Comintern, passed through it and other Yugoslav camps. Some historians mention a figure of several 100,000, but the point is not in the numbers, but in how strikingly similar the methods of Tito's and Stalin's prisons were. Who knows? Perhaps the conflict between Stalin and Tito flared up not so much because of a radical disagreement on the future of the world as because the two leaders were so similar to each other. The break with the Soviet Union forced Tito to seek new friends in the West. Under the angry voices from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its satellites, Yugoslavia began to receive military and financial aid from the class enemies across the ocean. Nevertheless, the Soviet-Yugoslav conflict was essentially a conflict between two leaders. Therefore, when in January of 1953, Josip Broz Tito officially becomes the first president in the history of the Yugoslav Republic, and less than 2 months later, Joseph Stalin dies. Relations between Tito and the Kremlin begin to markedly improve, up to the restoration of diplomatic ties in 1956. However, the reconciliation took place on Yugoslav terms. Tito, accurately but firmly, refused to become a Soviet satellite and join the Warsaw Pact. At the same time, Tito had no intention of breaking ties with Western countries. The Marshal became very friendly with John Kennedy and continued to receive substantial credits from American and Western European partners. One way or another, a close union between Yugoslavia and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics did not form in the future. On the contrary, there began a rapprochement with the Western countries. Assistance to the Greek communists ceased. The latter lost the Civil War, and in the 50s, Greece joined NATO. Well, the main achievement of Josip Broz Tito's policy, undoubtedly, was the creation of the non-alignment movement, founded at the Belgrade Conference in the 60s. This meeting marked the beginning of a new era in the decolonization process and set the orientations for the policies of the Third World countries. The main principle of this movement was the striving for mutual assistance and a clear refusal to participate in military blocs, be it NATO, the Warsaw Pact, or any other alliance of former empires. To support this idea, Tito personally conducted a tour of Asia and Africa, meeting with future leaders of the non-aligned movement countries. After this, the Soviet Union could no longer ignore Yugoslavia, which declared itself as a powerful force within the New World formation. Speaking of economic policy, Tito can be compared to the Spanish leader Francisco Franco, as both built a mixed economy. Both were dictators, and separatist tendencies existed in both countries. But their results were different. After Franco's death, Spain became a flourishing and united country, while Yugoslavia under Tito lost its economic prosperity and soon disintegrated. At first, he implemented the Soviet economic model, nationalizing industry and trying to collectivize agriculture. However, he encountered strong resistance from the peasants and limited the mechanization of agriculture. When in 1948 Tito broke off relations with Stalin, he deviated from the Soviet line. Yugoslavia was forced to produce its own weapons, receiving aid from the United States of America, and selling its military production to the non-aligned movement countries. As a result of the reforms of the 50s, Yugoslavia moved from state planning to a regulated market and horizontal links between enterprises. A new price system was introduced, and the rationing system was abolished. From the mid-60s, reforms accelerated, increasing the share of profit left at the disposal of enterprises and intensifying differentiation in labor remuneration. Banks became the main source of investment resources, which increased the share of investment financing. Also, Tito abolished travel visas for Western countries, thus contributing to a stable flow of tourists from Europe. The Soviet Union provided support in restoring the industrial base in Yugoslavia and allowed it to trade goods on the domestic market of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In the 60s-70s, when relations improved somewhat, Yugoslavia was remembered by Soviet citizens for its textiles and footwear, which were valued for their comfort, quality leather, and stylish design.
Very provocative. I wouldn't take such. So good shoes need to be taken.
This is related to Yugoslavia's reorientation to Western markets after the breakdown of relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In Moscow, even 2 large Yugoslav stores were operating, where you could find a variety of goods, including clothes from the popular Angelica brand, lamps, cosmetics, and dishes. Only remaining in the memory of Soviet citizens and in photographs is Belgrade and the real department store Yadrana, located at Profsoyuznaya Street 146. Now it's just a regular residential building. Other popular items were cigarettes under the brand Y, known for their taste. With notes of dry wood and sweet grassiness, the Vegeta seasoning, loved by Soviet housewives from the Croatian manufacturer Podravka, as well as the plasma chocolate biscuits, which were produced in unbelievable quantities of 16 million boxes a year. In addition to light food industry, separate enterprises and companies in the fields of transport, cosmetics, and household appliances also had success. For example, a brand founded in the year 1947 supplied transport vehicles to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, including buses and trucks. A feature of the trucks was their full compliance with the technical standards of Yugoslavia. And for example, a truck from the 110 family, equipped with a 150 horsepower engine, could wade through fords up to a meter deep. Among cosmetics, Bekutan baby jars were especially loved, and in the field of household appliances, the Gorenje company, founded in 1955 in a small one-named Slavic village, was rumored. By the end of the 60s, Yugoslavia was flourishing in all respects. International economic ratings were growing, and Yugoslav administrative bodies were considered reliable borrowers. A family without a car in the city was considered below average, and a single-story house in the village was a sign of poverty. However, despite the growth, half-hearted and contradictory reforms led to imbalance. After all, getting loans from the global financial market, the society itself did not change, and here began the rupture in the economic model. In Yugoslavia, there were factories where trucks, rockets and ammunition, airplanes, tanks, explosives, various clothes, furniture and books, electronics and metal structures were produced. And there were agricultural regions, all the benefits of a new life which were in increased productivity due to access to advanced agro-technologies. The self-management system at enterprises led to unequal pay for labor and inefficient use of resources. There was a gap in wage payment in different sectors, which was not characteristic of market economies. By the 70s, residents of industrial regions were already receiving 30 to 40% more than residents of purely agricultural regions. Where did the migration of the unemployed population to capitalist countries, where entry was only recently opened, begin? National diasporas began to form. Muslim ideas woke up among Bosniaks in the 70s, and the first textbook of the Croatian language was published instead of the state Serbo-Croatian language. And then there was also the global oil crisis of 1973, which, although it did not engulf the main countries of the Eastern Bloc, because by that time the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had already established its own extraction, but it strongly affected the economy of Yugoslavia, which was particularly vulnerable. Local goods began to lose competition with the Western equivalent. Export to the East increased, which did not bring significant benefits. Moscow was paying with non-convertible transferable rubles of the Council for mutual economic assistance, which couldn't be exchanged for capitalist countries' currencies. The foreign debt continued to grow inexorably, and Yugoslavia was losing its economic stability. But the real time bomb became the Constitution of 1974. Originally, the new constitution was supposed to lay the foundations of the new Yugoslav federalism, where the federal center renounces most of its economic, political, and other powers in favor of the federation participants, the republics. And even autonomous regions turned into quasi-states, while the rights of the autonomous regions of Kosovo and Vojvodina were effectively equated to the rights of the republics. Only issues of foreign policy, defense, and coordination of economic development remained with the federal center. According to Tito's plan, the new structure of the country was supposed to take a large part of the trump cards out of the hands of nationalists. However, it soon became clear that this focus was not successful. The republics quarreled more among themselves than they agreed, and each of them pulled the blanket over themselves. The general federal market was falling apart. The republics were more eager to cooperate with the border than with each other. The economic situation in the country was deteriorating, and the credits accumulated abroad were a heavy burden. Perhaps the country would have coped with this, if not for one, but in 1979, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics entered the war in Afghanistan. The West imposed sanctions against all Council for Mutual Economic Assistance countries in response. Because of this, Yugoslavia was unable to transition to production with computer numerical control machines and electronics in time, meaning it literally couldn't rearm itself to produce competitive products and repay its debts. A socio-political crisis began. Residents of industrial regions received the first economic blow, falling in terms of money to the level of representatives of agricultural regions. So, in conditions of absolute economic instability and growing internal tension, on May 4, 1980, Josip Broz Tito died. Despite all his shortcomings, he was at the head of Yugoslavia for almost 36 years, and hundreds of thousands of people across the Federation met the funeral procession with tears, often quite sincere. At the farewell ceremony in Zagreb, an unpleasant incident occurred. A sudden gust of wind tore the Yugoslav flag from the marshal's grave. People, devastated by Tito's death, then took this as a bad omen. It quickly became apparent that the final Yugoslav spiritual bastion, the cult of Tito, was on the verge of crumbling. Following the victory in World War II and self-managed socialism, it was covered in rust and was no longer capable of uniting the peoples inhabiting Yugoslavia. One way or another, the Republic of Yugoslavia, created by the great dictator, did not satisfy almost everyone. Serbian nationalists have always had a negative attitude towards the ethnic Croat Tito and believed that he built his multinational federation to the detriment of the Serbs. The inhabitants of prosperous Slovenia were tired of their wild and poor southern compatriots. The Croats remembered Tito's purges over the Ustasha after World War II and dreamed of the day when their dreams of an independent Croatian state would become a reality. The impending economic crisis in Yugoslavia led to a sharp decline in the standard of living of the population, which Tito was so proud of. In the year 1983, the Yugoslav government effectively admitted that it could never repay its foreign debts. Moreover, the venue for the upcoming Olympic Games was supposed to be the capital of Bosnia, Sarajevo, and in the midst of the crisis, Bosnia found itself alone with the costs of constructing Olympic facilities. Part of the budget of other federal subjects was directed towards their financing. As a result, other countries suffered from power outages, fuel restrictions, social program stoppages, and other consequences of budget cuts. At the same time, qualified specialists who came to Bosnia by shift method were paid stably and well, and the construction was covered in the central press. The Olympics were held at a decent level, but Bosnia went bankrupt, dragging all the republics down with it. The average pension has decreased by more than 40%, wages by 35%, and inflation by the second half of the 80s reached 1,000% per year. The system of multinational collective federal presidiums and interregional consensus, which was required for the adoption of most central decisions under the conditions of the malicious constitution, did not work in 1974. Members of the Union Executive Council had no desire whatsoever to negotiate with each other about anything. This coincided with the stabilization of the Yugoslav diaspora's material position. In Europe, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, trips to relatives in Europe became the norm. In parallel, processes of nationalism development were taking place. Under the guise of patriotism, informal youth associations appeared in each republic, and crime was activated against the background of simplification of economic activity. Meanwhile, Yugoslav economists were at the height of their game, conducting international negotiations, restructuring debts, stabilizing inflation, and carrying out another denomination. While this was happening, the elites of the Federation's subjects continued to divide the money each for their own benefit, and everyday nationalism began to turn into political flatness. Among the Croats, the Serbs, the Slavs, the Bosnians, the Macedonians. In Kosovo, Serbs were in conflict with minorities, mainly Albanians. The first demonstrations of Kosovo Albanians for independence began in the year 1981, gradually escalating up to the uprising in 1997. Where did the president of Yugoslavia, Ivan Stambolic, send his assistant, the newly appointed head of the Serbian communists, Slobodan Milosevic? And he told the Kosovo Serbs what they wanted to hear, started an anti-bureaucratic revolution, placing loyal people in Montenegro, Vojvodina, and Kosovo. During the intra-party struggle, he got rid of his main rival Ivan Stambolic, who, unlike Milosevic, was an anti-nationalist. Thanks to the majority in the presidency, Milosevic's representative Boris Aviovic was able to pass laws that reduced the autonomy of Kosovo and Vojvodina in favor of Serbia. Albanian miners from Kosovo began a strike, protesting against the new changes. In response, Milosevic deployed troops to suppress the protest. On the June 28th, he made a speech on the field where the Battle of Kosovo took place in 1389. One of the most important events in the national consciousness of the Serbs, in which he called for the restoration of unity and greatness of the Serbian people.
Dear friends and comrades, at this place, in the heart of Serbia, on the field of Kosovo, the events of centuries are present.
The most memorable fragment was Milosevic's statement that, in the name of this goal, armed battles are not excluded. In Slovenia and Croatia, people were dissatisfied with the situation. The Slovenian media began to call the new president a fascist, and Milosevic tried to tighten control over the Slavic press, which only intensified the Slavs' hatred for Serbian influence on the republic. Remember that Slovenia was the most developed republic, concentrating 40% of all Yugoslavia's industry and approximately 60% of the most high-tech. It was they who, for the sake of socialism, contributed more than anyone else to the common pot to help the lagging Bosnians and Macedonians. But when during the oil crisis they themselves needed help to improve production and maintain competition, there was no money. A decision was made to convene the 14th Congress, to which delegates from all republics were invited. The dispute was about whether to give additional autonomy to the republics or to continue centralizing power in Serbia. Every proposal of the president of Slovenia, Kukan, was blocked by the Serbian bloc, which included delegates from Montenegro, Vojvodina, Kosovo, and Serbia itself. Due to the inability to agree, the situation in the country became increasingly tense. The Slovenes soon left the Congress meeting place, followed by Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia. Unity could not be achieved, and Tito's party finally disintegrated. Its republican organizations began to change their names. Serbian and Montenegrin communists turned into socialists, Macedonian and Bosnian into social democrats. In Croatia, the Party of Democratic Changes appeared, and in Slovenia, the Party of Democratic Renewal. Meanwhile, the European Union did not stand aside. Already in the 70s, an association agreement was signed between the European Union and Yugoslavia, and by the 90s, its accession to the European Union was actively discussed, from the late 70s to the late 90s. And here, on the one hand, the global economic crisis, and on the other, that very bomb of delayed action. The Constitution of '74 gave the possibility to leave the Federation independently to join the European Union and extinguish debts on the principle of the last one pays for all. By the end of the 90s, developed members of the Federation, such as Croatia and Slovenia, received guarantees of imminent accession to the European Union with automatic transition of European Union agreements with Yugoslavia to these independent countries. Bosnia was still recovering from the economic crisis, and only wanted stability. The Kosovo Albanians wanted real autonomy. The Macedonians quietly observed Serbia as a model state. The nation was preparing to defend sovereignty, and the Montenegrins were ready to help. All that remained was finding a reason. They had what came to be known as the Match of Hatred on the 13th of May, 1999. On that day, 2,000 to 3,000 fans of the Belgrade Red Star arrived in Zagreb by train, calling themselves heroes. Their leader was the legendary Arkan Zeljko Raznatovic, a notorious Serbian criminal authority, and later a military figure. They were already awaited by the active grouping of the fighting wing of Zagreb's Dynamo. The clashes between the fans started almost at the station, and the atmosphere before the match was extremely electrified. The situation worsened as all sides in the conflict were ardent nationalists. And a few weeks before the match in Croatia, there were elections in which Franjo Tudjman, who advocated for independence, won. After the teams came out onto the field, the opposing sides staged a brawl. The Serbs were shouting, "Zagreb is Serbian," and "Death to Tudjman," while the Croats responded with "Serb on a spit," which was a well-known taunt at the time. The first to attack were the hooligans, who had broken the stadium barrier and rushed at the poor guys. The Serbs began to pelt their opponents with ripped seats and flares, and the Croats accepted the challenge and responded in kind. The police tried to defuse the conflict with batons and tear gas, pushing the Croats from the stands onto the pitch, which only angered the fans more. The heroes rushed to confront their opponents, and the enraged Croats, numbering about 500, overwhelmed the outnumbered police and broke through to the Serbs, who they began to beat with ripped seats and batons taken from the law enforcement officers. By this point, the match was halted, and the players were escorted off the field. However, the Croatian player Zvonimir Boban, unhappy with the actions of the police, kicked one of them, a Muslim Rafik Ahmetovic, further escalating the situation. More than 100 people were injured in the brawl, many with knife and even gunshot wounds. Many believe that the brawl at the match between Croatian Dinamo and Serbian Red Star led to the escalation of the conflict. After this game, violence became a common argument, which was used more often than peaceful political disputes. Already in June of the 90s, Tudjman initiated a campaign in Croatia to dismiss Serbs from government and police positions. In response, the Croatian Serbs declared autonomy. So the revolution began. The Croatian Serbs decided that they would not allow a repeat of the genocide and rose up in the city of Nin, blocking roads and seizing a small amount of weapons. They demanded territories where the majority were Serbs, and Borisov Jovic, who became the president of Yugoslavia, agreed to help them, as Croatia was a common enemy for them. But Tudjman did not agree to the demands of the Serbs and ordered helicopters to be sent to Knin to suppress the rebellion. In response, Jovic ordered the Air Force to intercept the Croatian helicopters, and they were forced to retreat. Having a weaker army, Tudjman understood that he needed to find other ways to achieve independence. He negotiated with Hungary for weapon supplies, and in Slovenia, he supported the conduct of a referendum on independence. And the Slavs voted for separation from Yugoslavia. These events forced the Yugoslav government to declare a state of emergency in the country. Croatian representative Stjepan Mesic had a long dispute with Borisov Jovic. Stjepan argued that the Serbs want to build a greater Serbia, in which there will be no place for other nationalities. At the same time, Jovic accused the Croats of separatism and attempts to destroy Yugoslavia. After the collapse of the negotiations, the only solution left was war. However, Bosnia, which almost completely separated Serbia from Croatia and Slovenia, refused to participate in the war on anyone's side, which slightly cooled the conflict. But at the time of fifth, in May of 1991, Jovic's term as the head of the Yugoslav presidency ended. Mesic tried to become the new president, but the preference was given to another politician loyal to Milosevic, Sedo Bajramovic. The Croats responded with a referendum on independence, which was easily won thanks to the boycott of the Croatian Serbs. On the 25th of June 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence, starting the bloodiest conflict in Europe in recent times. Fortunate Slovenia, with its homogeneous population of 95% of the republic's residents being Slovenes, and a long-standing local resentment towards the Wild South, naturally became the first candidate to separate from the crisis-ridden Yugoslav Federation. On the night of the 25th to the 26th of June 1991, a solemn flag-raising ceremony of independent Slovenia took place in Ljubljana, and the following morning, Slavic policemen attacked and captured part of the Yugoslav border posts on the borders with Austria, Italy, and Hungary. The headquarters of the 14th Ljubljana and the 31st Maribor Army Corps were surrounded. When all peaceful attempts to regulate the situation were unsuccessful, Belgrade used the last trump card of the Yugoslav People's Army. Yugoslav People's Army. Slovenia and the north of Croatia were under the command of the 5th Military District, led by General Colonel Konrad Kolchak, a Slovene who always supported the unity of Yugoslavia. He had several army corps and a significant amount of armed forces at his disposal. The main striking force of the Slavic separatists became the partisans. The territorial defense of Slovenia had over 15,000 soldiers, armed with light weapons and rockets, and trained to conduct guerrilla warfare on home ground. In addition, mass destruction weapons were put into operation. The television and the opponents began to throw each other with disinformation with a triple bottom.
Good evening, respected viewers. Let's get acquainted with the events that marked this day.
The Slovenes and their sympathizers spoke of the malicious aggression of Yugoslavia against the young Republic of Yugoslavia, blamed the bloodshed on the Slavic separatists, and accused the police of using the civilian population as a human shield. Already on the 28th of June, 1991, the day after the start of combat operations, Slavic nationality officers of the Yugoslav Army began to leave the Yugoslav People's Army en masse. They were followed by other servicemen who had no desire to die for the territorial integrity of a multinational federation that had gone bankrupt. Executing orders from Belgrade seemed like a betrayal to the Serbian soldiers of the Yugoslav People's Army towards their people, who were also infected with ideas of nationalism and separatism at the time. The battles between the federal forces and the Slavic militias were chaotic and senseless. The Yugoslav People's Army armored vehicles were roaming, falling into ambushes and taking losses. On the evening of July 3, 1991, the leadership of Slovenia announced a ceasefire to allow Yugoslav forces to leave the country's territory without fear. In the end, the short and bloodless war ended 10 days after it began. The European Union put pressure on Yugoslavia, which was mired in debt and loans, calling the parties to the negotiation table. On July 7th, Croatia, Slovenia, and Yugoslavia signed the Brioni Agreement, under which Yugoslavia withdrew its troops from Slovenia, but continued to collect a small amount of taxes and Slavic revenues. 3 months later, Slovenia completely separated from Yugoslavia, taking advantage of its territorial remoteness and the fears in Croatia. If everything ended relatively quickly and bloodlessly in multi-ethnic Slovenia, one could only dream of this in multinational Croatia. In September of 1991, a battle for barracks erupted all over Croatia, similar to the events in Slovenia. This included the storming of military units of the Yugoslav People's Army by the Croatian National Guard, forces of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and ultra-right party fighters. The main goal was to capture heavy weaponry for the impending conflict with the Serbs and the federal government. Soon, regular units of the Yugoslav army were introduced into Croatia as peacekeepers. The battle for Vukovar, primarily inhabited by Serbs, became one of the bloodiest confrontations in this war. The fierce street fights, sieges, and mass bombings by the Yugoslav People's Army were unreasonably compared to the Battle of Stalingrad in the Western media. The Croatian side defended with limited resources and small forces, while the Yugoslav People's Army had a significant advantage in armor and weaponry. The battle lasted several months and led to significant human losses and destruction of the city. As a result, the city of Vukovar was practically destroyed, and the restoration took many years. The battle for Vukovar became a symbol of violence and ethnic conflicts that tore apart former Yugoslavia during those years. In the south, Macedonia also held a referendum and declared independence, while The Hague tried to conduct peace negotiations with the participation of all 6 presidents of the Yugoslav republics. Tudjman insisted that Croatia has the right to independence. Milosevic said that in this case, the same right exists for the Krajina state of the reconstituted Serbs in Croatian territory. Lord Carrington, the head of the conference, asked Milosevic if he would agree to recognize Croatia's independence if it promised to respect the rights of Serbs living in Croatian territory. And to everyone's surprise, Milosevic agreed. However, this would have led to all 6 republics going down this path. And he reconsidered. He had no plans for the complete disintegration of Yugoslavia. In November of 1991, Vukovar finally fell, and the Serbs carried out a mass execution of Croatian military personnel. As a result of this battle, the Yugoslav People's Army and federal authorities suffered reputational losses due to the brutality of the civil war and the failure of the military spirit and loyalty of the servicemen. Desertion became a mass phenomenon even among those who had previously supported the Belgrade authorities, including the Serbs and Montenegrins. In addition, the Croats had time to create their own armed forces and gained international support. The Croatian Serbs received unrecognized education in the Republic of Serbian Krajina, which remained a semi-autonomous region. The ceasefire agreement came into force in January 1992, according to the United Nations Security Resolution. When peacekeepers arrived in Croatian territory, despite their presence, tension between Serbs and Croats remained. Among all the Yugoslav republics, Bosnia and Herzegovina was the most diverse, primarily in terms of religion and ethnicity. It was home to a large number of Bosniak Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats. In October of 1991, negotiations began on separation. Initially, Bosnia and Herzegovina agreed to join the mini-Yugoslavia, but the ideas of separatism, fueled by local factors and radical Muslim leaders, began to gain support. The Serbs wanted to get 65% of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Croats 35%, which left the Muslim majority without land. This led to a referendum in which Bosnia became independent, thereby ending the existence of Yugoslavia. The federation now consisted only of the 2 republics of Serbia and Montenegro. The Serbs formed the Republic of Srpska, and the Croats the Croatian Republic of Herceg-Bosnia. The European Union added fuel to the fire by recognizing Bosnia-Herzegovina's independence on April 7, 1992, and the Yugoslav army, leaving a pile of heavy weapons to the Bosnian Serbs. In April 1992, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, was already engulfed in violence and chaos, where each side sought to control this strategically important city. Former Yugoslav army soldiers went to aid the Bosnian Serbs. Their commander became Ratko Mladic. Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic had few chances left to hold on to power. The Bosnians managed to capture a large part of Sarajevo, but the other major cities fell under the control of the Serbs and Croats. The Bosnian Serbs received a significant amount of weapons and equipment from the Yugoslav People's Army, and many Yugoslav military personnel from Bosnia joined the army of the Republika Srpska. Sarajevo was subjected to artillery fire from their side, leading to destruction and civilian casualties. The Bosniaks faced a shortage of weapons and ammunition and resorted to ideological mobilization of fighters, including the radicalization of ideology. Bosnian Muslims, in the absence of weapons and preparation, began to use terms and methods associated with jihad in their combat actions. In the year 1993, American journalist Bill Carter, shocked by the experience of Sarajevo, a huge European city that found itself in the ring of artillery and sniper blockade, came here. He lived in a burnt-out building, drank water from the river, and filmed reports about life in Sarajevo. In a basement for the safety of foreign guests, he filmed the Miss Sarajevo Beauty Contest of the 90s under the famous slogan, "Don't let them kill us," which he later told to Bono. He was so moved by this story that he inspired U2 and Luciano Pavarotti to create a soundtrack for Carter's Miss Sarajevo film. millions of people around the world learned about the tragedy of this city and still remember it by the first notes of Miss Sarajevo. In the south of Bosnia and Herzegovina, parallel to the war between the Serbs and Muslims, a war was going on between the Muslims and Croats. The Ustasha, left jobless after the truce between Croatia and the Serbian Krajina, came to Herzegovina, where they attacked mosques and killed Muslims. The war was very brutal. Soldiers were indiscriminate, as it was not just armies fighting, but nationalities. Ethnic cleansings, military raids, and atrocities were committed by all sides of the conflict. At that time, Bosnians abandoned their homes and fled to the city of Srebrenica in hopes of protecting themselves and their families, as the United Nations declared this city a safe zone in the early 90s. Meanwhile, Sarajevo became more peaceful. The United Nations peacekeeping mission could not completely stop the war, but it was able to organize the delivery of humanitarian aid to the besieged city, which helped the population survive the cold winter. From the 90s to the early 90s, from the spring of 1994, artillery shelling almost ceased. However, the city still suffered from the activity of snipers. Particularly dangerous became the highly visible Zmaja Street, soon to be named Sniper Alley. Together with that, the leaders of the three sides worked on the constitution of the future, Bosnia and Herzegovina. The United Nations declared that it would protect Bosnian enclaves with the aim of stopping the war. The Vance-Owen Plan was proposed, according to which Bosnia was divided along ethnic lines, where each of the three main communities, Serbian, Croatian, and Muslim, would have an advantage. In 3 out of 10 provinces, Sarajevo would become an independent province. Although Radovan Karadzic, the Serbian leader, signed this plan, the Assembly of the Republic of Srpska rejected it. Later, a new plan was proposed by Owen Stoltenberg, which envisaged an agreement on Bosnia and Herzegovina as a union of 3 states and 3 peoples, with the same percentage ratios: 52% for the Serbs, 31% for the Muslims, and 17% for the Croats. However, the Skupština also rejected this plan. In the end, Presidents Izetbegovic and Tudjman united against the Serbs, which led to the creation of a Muslim-Croat alliance. March 6, 1994. The sabotage of Owen Stoltenberg's plan by the Bosnian Serbs caused disappointment in the Yugoslav leadership, already under sanctions from the West. On August 4, 1994, Yugoslavia closed its borders and imposed its own sanctions against disobedient neighbors. This meant that the Yugoslavs were openly betraying the Republic of Serbia, and the Bosnian Serbs were refusing to submit to Belgrade. After the NATO airstrikes were halted for the winter, the armed forces of the Republic of Serbia's offensive on the Sarajevo front came to an uneasy standstill, during which both sides continued mutual provocations and combat actions. In 1995, the Army of the Republic of Serbia took the same dangerous enclave of Srebrenica in its clutches and carried out a massacre there, killing approximately 8,000 Bosnian Muslims. The Serbs also shelled the marketplace in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, where 68 civilians were killed. In response to this, NATO sent them an ultimatum demanding the removal of their heavy weapons from the Sarajevo hills. But the Serbs responded with a refusal. 2 days later, NATO began Operation Deliberate Force, striking at the positions of the Bosnian Serbs. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic began to demand that the Bosnian Serbs allow Serbia to make peace on their behalf, threatening to withdraw support from Belgrade. At the same time, Croatia was liquidating the self-proclaimed Serbian republics, and on its territory, together with the Bosniaks, they began to fight against the Republic of Serbia. Vitaly Churkin, Russia's representative to the European Union, visited Pali near Bosnia's capital Sarajevo in 1995. He discussed with local authorities the peace plan proposed by Moscow to regulate the armed conflict, and later commented on the intransigence of the Bosnian Serbs, who were stricken by military madness, to the Kommersant newspaper. On December 14, 1995, the Dayton Agreement, which was agreed upon by the leaders of Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina a month earlier, came into force. This agreement divided Bosnia and Herzegovina in a ratio of 51 to 49, creating a strange state formation consisting of the Muslim Croat Federation and the Serb Republic. If in the first half of the 90s the situation in the country was overshadowed by dramatic events in other republics of the former Yugoslavia, now Kosovo has reappeared on the scene. After the abolition of autonomy for Kosovo Albanians in the 90s, Milosevic began to pursue a pro-Serbian policy in this region, persecuting the Albanian opposition. This policy also included restrictions in the fields of education, healthcare, and employment of Albanians, as well as repression and violation of human rights. The Kosovo Liberation Army, created a year later, was officially recognized by the United States of America as a terrorist organization. However, following the Serbia conflict, the United States started connecting with the terrorists. And in 1997, when Milosevic became president of Yugoslavia again, the Kosovo Army responded with attacks on police stations and military posts, armed not only by the United States of America, but also by means of the mafia structures of Albanian immigrants operating in Italy, obtained in particular through drug trafficking. The Kosovo Army gradually developed. In March of 1998, Milosevic began a military police operation in Kosovo to restore constitutional order, the victims of which were about 1,000 local residents. 230,000 people fled to neighboring countries, primarily to Macedonia, where the United Nations organized temporary camps for them. The scale of the military actions expanded, and the civilian population suffered. Western countries seriously concerned themselves with the Kosovo problem. In case of further escalation, NATO threatened to strike military targets in Yugoslavia. The threats substantiated and forced President Slobodan Milosevic to sign an agreement with the United States Representative Richard Holbrooke about the cessation of armed resistance on October 20, 1998. In summary, the Kosovo Army units withdrew their tanks and heavy artillery. The ceasefire was violated by both sides and finally ended in January 1999, when bodies of killed Albanians were found in the village of Rakak. 45 people were killed, and the Yugoslav military was blamed, who, in turn, claimed that their opponents fell with weapons in their hands. Both sides were urged to immediately start negotiations, which began on February 8th at the Rambouillet Castle near Paris, and ended with the adoption of a compromise solution about granting Kosovo broad autonomy within Yugoslavia. Soon, the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia intensified their actions in the conflict zone, and the peace process was disrupted. The clashes with the Kosovo Army gained even more intensity. For the first time, Western countries warned Belgrade about the imminent use of force on January 30, 1999. But now Slobodan Milosevic decided not to back down, and on the 24th of March, the Allied force air operation began. 14 countries participated in it, and in total, 639 strike and 365 reconnaissance and support aircraft were involved. The first bombs fell on Yugoslavia, leading to human casualties, catastrophic destruction, and serious threats to the environment. The United Nations never agreed with this, and these bombings are still remembered by Americans. Precision strikes targeted military sites, energy facilities, communication links, and bridges. And although the NATO command warned about them in advance so that people could leave dangerous places, strikes also occurred on civilian targets. By mistake, the alliance's aviation bombed a passenger bus on a bridge near Pristina, as a result of which 23 people died and the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Russia considered NATO's action bypassing the United Nations Security Council as aggression. The gravest crisis in Moscow-West relations emerged following the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse. Russian President Boris Yeltsin addressed the world, in which he asked Clinton not to take this tragic, dramatic step. This is a war in Europe, and maybe more, he said. Milosevic. Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov, on the day the operation began, canceled his visit to the United States of America in protest, making a notable turnaround over the Atlantic. It's important to note that out of all the operations in Yugoslavia, the Union force was the only one that Russia categorically disagreed with. On the night of June 12, 1999, Russian peacekeeping paratroopers, ahead of NATO forces, entered Yugoslavian territory in March Brosk, from Bosnia and Herzegovina. They occupied the Slatina airport near Pristina, and a few hours later, units from other foreign armies arrived there. Although the American General Wesley Clark, commanding NATO forces in Europe, ordered British General Michael Jackson, who was in charge of the group in the Balkans, to drive the Russians out of the airport. The Briton replied that he was not going to start World War III. Subsequently, the famous British singer James Blunt, who served in the NATO group in 1999, testified about General Clark's order to take the airport from the Russian paratroopers. About 200 Russians were stationed at the airport. General Wesley Clark's direct order was to dislodge them. Clark used an unusual expression for us, for example, to destroy. There were political reasons for capturing the airport, but the practical consequence would have been an attack on the Russians. During the interview with Yunusbek Yevkurov, president of the Republic of Ingushetia, he was a main intelligence directorate major at the time of the reported events. It became known that starting from the end of May of the 90s, a group of 18 main intelligence directorate soldiers secretly infiltrated the territory of the Slatin airport and effectively controlled it until the approach of the airborne battalion. All the circumstances of this operation are still classified. In early June, Milosevic was forced to agree with NATO's demands and withdraw the Yugoslav army from the territory of Kosovo. Russia, having condemned NATO's bombings, supported the withdrawal of the Yugoslav army and the arrival of peacekeepers. Obviously, Moscow pursued its own goals. Where there was no room for particularly hot relations with the Serbs, many Serbs could not reconcile with the loss of Kosovo. At the beginning of the 2000 years, criminal proceedings were initiated against generals Svetozar Marjanovic and Obrad Stevanovic for signing the capitulation, but it did not go to court. For almost 10 years, Kosovo formally remained part of Serbia, but in fact became an international protectorate. Since then, in the disputed region, it either subsided or flared up again. Thousands of Serbs continue to live in Kosovo, considering it their ancestral land. In March of 2004, mass riots broke out there again, resulting in pogroms of Serbian homes and the death of people. The crisis developed further at the end of 2012. Beginning of 2013. However, it did not come to armed conflict after all. However, due to the risk of new ethnic clashes, United Nations observers remain in the region. On the 17th of February 2008, Kosovo officially declared independence. At present, 108 out of 193 countries in the world maintain diplomatic relations with them, including Serbia, Russia, and China, as well as Israel and one NATO member. Spain, which has problems with its own separatist movements, does not recognize the statehood of Kosovo. As for Slobodan Milosevic, the NATO operation initially did not affect the stability of his regime. On the contrary, the Serbs rallied around this authoritarian politician in the face of foreign aggression, which they considered unjust. But the bombing of Yugoslavia severely hit the country's economy. In the following 2,000 years, the opposition was finally able to unite. Its leader in the presidential elections was Professor Vojislav Koštunica. According to official data, he gained 49% of the votes in the first round, so Milosevic declared the need for a second round. But the opposition spoke of falsification and brought thousands of people to the streets. The so-called bulldozer revolution took place. The television building was stormed with the help of this machine. The president was forced to retreat, and the following year he was handed over to The Hague, where the International Court is located. Milosevic and 4 other politicians were accused of crimes against humanity, murders, persecutions on political, racial, and religious grounds, deportations, as well as violations of laws and customs of war. The trial began in 2002 year. It lasted 4 years and was periodically interrupted due to the politician's illness. Milosevic died in jail in 2006, never living to see the verdict. Many believe that his widow, Mira Markovic, bears a solid responsibility for the events in Yugoslavia in the 90s. She was known for her strong will and total influence on Slobodan. Her toughness and strength were combined with beauty. so she was called the Iron Butterfly. Among politically active women, she was compared to Elena Ceausescu, wife of Nicolae Ceausescu, about whom we had a video on our channel, and Imelda Marcos, a Filipino politician. In 2003, Yugoslavia finally ceased to exist, and the state of Serbia and Montenegro appeared in its place. Soon, in 2006, Montenegro held a referendum, becoming independent from Serbia. Thus ended the era of Yugoslavia. Now, the separate stages of the brutal civil wars are still visible. For example, in the center of Belgrade, a few houses bombed and destroyed have been left as a monument, in plain sight. In Serbia, there are still very strong anti-NATO sentiments. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the very same place, in the city of Srebrenica, a memorial to the mass genocide has been established. If you try to briefly summarize the main outcome of the Yugoslav war, it comes down to the fact that the most developed country in Eastern Europe turned into a backwater within a few years. Some bear direct responsibility for this degradation. Others were innocent victims, caught in the whirlwind of hatred. But the further we go, the fewer there are who want to separate one from the other and restore justice.